I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Marc Faber. He's founder of Marc Faber Limited, publisher of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom Report, also author of many books, including our producer Dimitri's favorite one, this one, Tomorrow's Gold, Asia's Age of Discovery. Now, Dr. Faber told me the issue of inflation and deflation isn't that simple exactly because inflation is the increase in the quantity of money and credit, and there are symptoms of it that can show up as higher wages or food prices, etc. But the problem of printing money is that no one knows exactly where it will flow. So in the 90s, you saw it flow into the NASDAQ, and then there was a collapse. And then it went into real estate, and when that collapsed, later it went into emerging economies. So where does he think the money has flown now? Listen.
The money has flown into predominantly equities since October 4th of last year, when the S&P was at 1,074, and we went now to over 1,400. So, you know, the difficulty is you don't know for sure where the money will flow to, and the money flows into one asset and then into another one. The problem being that they are all at the same time with the same intensity, and then bubbles are built and then they deflate. So the issue of inflation and deflation should be essentially the question: which asset prices are going to be inflated and then will collapse?
Where do you think we are right now? What do you think has been inflated, and what do you think is going to collapse?
Well, the ego of Mr. Bernanke has been badly inflated. But aside from that, and by the way also of Mr. Obama, but aside of that, I would say government debt is badly inflated. And also, if you look at the income and wealth distribution in the world, we have had a tremendous inflation among the so-called 1%. They're not even 1% of the population. There may be a quarter of the percent of the population, people with 100 million and more. And these people, they have become immensely rich. We have, you know, billionaires. When I started to work in 1970, in the 70s, there was one billionaire in the world, Mr. Ludwig. And then in 1980, because of the oil wealth creation, we had 8 billionaires. Now, officially, there are 1,200 billionaires, but actually, a lot of billions are not known by Forbes. So my estimate that there are at least 1,500 billionaires in the world.
And you know, my question, since you did mention the 70s, I want to kind of compare to when you were coming up as an investor in that time, in terms of how much people were guessing and questioning what impact government policy and central bank policy would be in the way that we see it today with, you know, every time you turn on the TV, it's this discussion of risk on, risk off, people guessing and betting at government policy and its impact. How similar or different is this from when you were coming up as an investor, for example, during the stagflation of the 70s?
Well, I think you're asking a very important question, because the central bankers and, say, the financial people will tell you, well, the bailouts were necessary and the money printing was necessary because otherwise the crisis would have been much worse. But actually, if you look at the origin of the crisis and the causes, they were actually interventions by the government, notably the interventions by central banks by keeping interest rates artificially low, that created the bubbles in the first place. And don't forget, one of the big policy mistakes was the bailout of LTCM in 1998, and other policy mistakes including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two fraudulent organizations that were so-called government-sponsored enterprises. Both of them went naturally bankrupt like no other company before. But what do you expect? Whatever the government does, it does it much worse than the private sector.
And so it sounds like you are saying that it's gotten worse. My question is, we live under this assumption that the U.S. is a free market economy. Where do you think we are? Do you think it's fair to say that we live in a market economy anymore, or is it mostly market-driven, or is it worse than that? Where are we?
Well, I think it's the same question we have democracies in the Western world, but are people really free? When I travel through the US and through immigration and through airports, I don't feel like a free individual at all. And so I think that the interventions by governments into the marketplace have actually destroyed the market. And if you think about it, we have zero interest rates, but we have cost of living increases of, say, 5% to 10%. So people who have been savers, they now have, say, $1 million or $10 million on deposits. They're honest people. They never speculated in their lives. They lived off the interest on their deposits. And now they get zero interest rate, but because of the cost of living increases of 5 to 10% per annum, their purchasing power is diminishing by 5 to 10% per annum. In other words, they are faced with an expropriation by the government, but it doesn't sound that way. It's not obvious to everybody that it amounts to this expropriation. But it's like if you would have a deposit in a bank, $100,000 at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year you only get $95,000 back. If there was zero inflation.
Right.
That is the same thing that having, say, 5% inflation and zero interest rates, your purchasing power loses by 5%. And it's basically killing decent people, and it's forcing actually people to speculate in something.
Yeah, or forcing people to just be financially repressed if you're a saver in the U.S. and you don't want to take that risk. And you've been very clear as far as what you think the Fed's going to do, that it's going to print money as far as the eye can see, and that central banks in general will continue to print. So given the fact that we've already seen a massive amount of money printing in the U.S., it's really only been effective to paper over a lot of problems in the economy. My question is, given the monetary system and the way that it works, is it even possible for central banks to achieve what they're trying to, no matter how much money they pump out?
That is a very good question. You know, this money printing works until it doesn't work anymore. But the difficulty is to know on which day or which year it won't work anymore. But basically, whoever believes that central banks can control economic activity, like someone would drive a car and press on the accelerator and then on the brakes, that is not the case for central banks, nor for any planned economy. And we've known now, after the experiment with socialism and communism and the planned economy, what a complete disaster government interventions into the marketplace have been. But this is precisely what the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are trying to do. And for sure it will fail over time. But it may work in the sense that the stock market goes up for a while and could go up massively. I mean, I've seen high inflation countries like Brazil or Argentina or Mexico or Germany, and during the money printing phase, stocks sometimes went up like 500 or 1,000 times within just 1 or 2 years. And then the whole system collapsed, but the whole system. And this, I think, will happen.
Well, what do you think it'll translate to politically when you say that? Because I know you said eventually we'll see social unrest or politicians will take us to war. So what kind of wars, and who's going to be fighting them?
I wish I know
Million-dollar
what
question,
kind of war.
right?
The only thing I know, the U.S. has been very good at finding enemies anywhere in the world when they wanted to find someone. But I would say my timetable is like this. If you look at the last 20 years, the money printing has essentially benefited a very narrow group of people, the so-called 1%. As I said, I think it's the 1%, it's the 0.25% of the population. And the large part of the population, say the 50% lower income groups, in other words, the middle class, the lower middle class, and the working class, their standards of living haven't increased in 20 years, basically.
That's right.
And they are more indebted than 20 years ago, and the U.S. is more indebted than 20 years ago. You just have to look at the student loans. The student loans now are over $1 billion.
Yeah, student loans more than $1 trillion.
That they will be repaid. But anyway, so they will continue to print money, not right away with the S&P at 1400, but say the S&P drops 100 or 200 points, for sure there will be money printing. For sure there will be QE3. If the S&P drops to 1,000, there'll be QE4, 5, 6, whatever. And it won't help the economy really, and it won't help boost the standards of living of the middle class and the lower classes, but it will help people that own shares and gold and maybe some real estate in selected areas. But discontent among the population will grow. Then the next station is, how do you distract the population? So you either target a minority group, say, we've seen now attacks repeatedly against Goldman Sachs. I think they're unjustified, because what Goldman Sachs did, all the others have also done. No exception. And if that doesn't happen, they'll go to war, and they'll find an enemy and say the enemy is threatening us, and we have to kind of hold the system together and fight the enemy and so forth. And then eventually the whole financial bubble will be deflated, the whole derivatives market. There are, I don't know how, a quadrillion derivatives outstanding in the world. You can't imagine what quadrillion is. It's 1,000 trillion.
Yeah.
And this whole bubble will be deflated one day, and I mean, there will be massive wealth destruction.
Still ahead, at one time, about a decade ago, Dr. Marc Faber's advice for young people involved moving to Asia and concubines. Well, you will not believe what he says now as far as advice, how times have changed. You'll hear it after the break. But first, your closing market numbers.